However, that being said, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari may need no introduction, but it sure as hell needs an explanation. There are two main challenges when trying to grapple with this movie, not least the fact that it was made in 1920 in Weimar, Germany. So motion pictures hadn't really existed but for 20 or 30 years by that point, depending on how many of the early experiments you want to count. Motion pictures hadn't existed as an industrialized production of entertainment for mass audiences, but for 10 years at that. And Weimar, Germany was a brief experiment in German democracy sandwiched between the old aristocratic order that was dismantled at the end of the First World War, and then the rise of Nazism and the onset of the Second World War. So, in other words, the entire cultural context in which this movie was made and originally released is completely alien to us now. The saying goes, the past is a different country, they do things differently there. And that's what history is about, an attempt to play tourist in that foreign country. It's a challenge, but it is doable, and part of my mission over the coming hour or so is to help give you some frames of reference to make that lost cultural context not quite so alien. We have a second challenge in front of us, though, and that's that our knowledge of the production of this film and the artistic decisions that went into it come to us mainly through three separate first-hand accounts, as well as some supporting documentation, such as the original screenplay, journalists' account of visiting the set, contemporaneous reviews, and so on. The primary account, and by primary I mean the one that's been most widely disseminated and influential, is the reminiscence of screenwriter Hans Janowitz. In 1941, some 20-some years after the movie was made, he wrote a booklet, not quite enough to call a real book, but it was longer than an essay, called Caligari, the Story of a Famous Story. And in that he detailed the origins, development, production, and reception of the film. Now, the booklet wasn't published at the time, but it was used extensively by Siegfried Krauss in the creation of his book, From Caligari to Hitler. And as the title implies, Krauss leans heavily on the cabinet of Dr. Caligari as the keystone of his thesis about how German silent cinema tracks the inevitable rise of Adolf Hitler. Basically, everything Krauss says about Caligari is taken from Janowitz's manuscript. And while Krauss's book has fallen from esteem over the years and is the subject of fairly intense criticism over its flawed methodology and screwy conclusions, the fact remains that it was itself an incredibly influential work and for decades established the default understanding of Caligari. And then in 1972, Simon & Schuster published a script book to Caligari. Now, script books were prevalent back in the days before home video releases of movies, and they featured reprints of the shooting scripts to famous important films, illustrated by stills and framed by some analytical essays and production histories. If you couldn't stream a movie on demand or watch it on Blu-ray, back in the day that was your only alternative. And in the case of Caligari, in 1972, the wider world believed that the original screenplay had not survived, and so this edition published a transcript of what happened on screen, and the framing essays were little more than summarized excerpts from Janowitz's Story of a Famous Story. And then in 1990, Mike Budd's collection of scholarly work on the film included a substantial chunk of Janowitz's text intact. So that's account number one. Account number two is that of Erich Pommer, the studio chief for Decla, the company that made the film. He later went on to run UFA, which in fact evolved out of Decla, and was responsible for producing nearly every major German silent film you've ever heard of. It is hard to overstate the significance of Erich Pommer on the development of Weimar cinema. Pommer wrote a tribute to Janowitz's co-screenwriter Karl Mayr in 1947, in which he recounted his memories of meeting Mayr and working on Caligari. Later in 1959, Pommer was interviewed in Films in Review and spoke on the history of Caligari again. Now, account number three comes from Hermann Warm, the chief production designer. He spoke with Lottie Eisner, who reported his memories in her book, Haunted Screen, which was, along with Krauss's book, one of the key texts in establishing the scholarly understanding of German silent cinema. Now, under normal circumstances, if you see an interview with the film's producer and screenwriter, maybe they're on an audio commentary or something like that, you're likely to think, awesome, okay, here's the straight dope. This is what really went on. And conversely, if you just get the production designer, chances are you're going to think you're getting shortchanged. What does he know? But in the case of Caligari, the supporting documentation and independent third-party sources generally affirm what Hermann Warm has to say, and that same documentation is frequently at odds with what Janowitz and Pommer say. And that's the thing. These accounts don't jibe with each other. On fundamental details, these three men profoundly contradict one another. And so, for the last couple of decades, this has been the default mode of scholarship on Caligari, to pit these different histories against each other and see where they clash. And in turn, this has become a let's gang up on Janowitz game, because it was his version of events that was most widely read and which lasted the longest time as the received wisdom on the film. So if you're going to go around debunking myths, necessarily you're going to be knocking him down a notch or two. Now, the thing is, of course these stories don't mesh. For one thing, they each worked in a very different sphere of responsibility within an industrial, corporate film production. They each handled different pieces of the puzzle. Moreover, by the time any of them get around to telling their stories, a lot of time has passed. Now imagine if I asked you to pick some event that happened to you 20 or 30 years ago and to write up your reminiscence of it. But, okay, there's a catch. You have to write it like a story. It's for publication, so you want it to read well. And then when you finished, I'm going to go find two other people who experienced the same thing, have them write up their memories in the same way, and then I'm going to take these stories and hand them over to a bunch of academics who are going to be paid to pick them apart and find the discrepancies. That's a gotcha game if I ever heard one. What's more significant and ultimately more useful is the extent to which their differing perspectives actually cohere. We've got a Venn diagram of sorts where they intersect, the places where they agree, or if not quite agree, at least they don't profoundly disagree. And if we try to navigate a path through those intersections, being as understanding as possible about the likelihood of foggy memories, or the incentives that they face to tell their stories in self-serving ways, maybe we can actually get a decent handle on what really maybe happened. Well, we got to start somewhere, so let's start with Hans Janowitz. He grew up in Prague. Now, he wasn't born there, but he considered it his hometown, and by the age of 17, he was already a published author. By 18, he was a professional theater critic. By 22, he was a paid actor on the theatrical stage. He was an artistic prodigy, in other words, and capable of turning those prodigious talents to his career advantage. And then, at age 24, he joined the Austrian army, as young men were expected to do in 1914. His intelligence and maturity got him advanced to captain, and he spent 5.5 years in the infantry. During that military career, his patriotic enthusiasm quickly deteriorated into anger and hatred. His brother Franz, a poet and a pacifist, died in battle. As Janowitz put it, Franz uselessly bled to death for the benefit of a shameful government for which he felt nothing but contempt. And as the war neared its end in 1918, Janowitz was on leave from the Italian front in Berlin. He was mourning his brother, and he met a girl named Gilda Langer. She was mourning her fiancé. Comrades in grief, they found they had other things in common too. Both were actors, and of course they were boy and girl. Love bloomed in the shadow of the Great War, and Janowitz thought it was fate. So when Gilda suggested that they go see a psychic and have their fortunes told, of course Janowitz readily agreed. The clairvoyant made an ominous prediction. She said that Janowitz would return safely from the front and survive the war, so yeah, that part was good. But she also said that Gilda would die. And it turns out that both pieces of this prediction came true. You'd never be able to convince Janowitz that this was anything other than the mysterious forces of the universe at play. Before her tragic death, Gilda had another momentous suggestion. She put forth that her boyfriend Hans really ought to team up with Karl Mayr to write a movie script. So, time to meet Karl Mayr. 4 years younger than Janowitz, the story goes that he was the son of a successful Austrian businessman who decided to quit his job and dedicate himself to the casinos of Monte Carlo. He had a foolproof system, you see, and he was bankrupted by that system, so much for foolproof, and he committed suicide in shame. So as a boy, Karl Mayr had to be the breadwinner for his family, supporting his mother, his younger brothers, his widowed sister-in-law, and her baby. And this he did by writing plays. So perhaps not the most lucrative of professions, but Karl had his muse to serve, just like Hans did. And Gilda's suggestion had been a good one. Hans and Karl had similar sensibilities, but different enough perspectives to make a good team. They started writing together in the winter of 1918 to 1919. For 6 weeks they worked, drawing from a variety of personal experiences to form a collage of disturbing, eerie ideas. Janowitz said that he and Mayr were the parents of this film, and he went so far as to specify which parent was which. Janowitz was the father, the one who planted the seed, and Mayr was the mother who carried it to fruition. For weeks, the two screenwriters took long walks together, talking about the various ideas, influences, and experiences that they would assemble together into this story. And these walks usually led the two of them to an amusement park in Kantstrasse. Their story took shape in an amusement park, and so it should come as no surprise to us that the story that he wrote would be largely set in one. Now, at this Kantstrasse park, there was a sideshow attraction. It was called Man or Machine, and in it, a hypnotized strongman predicted the future. They decided to build their story around such a figure, but they found that their hypnotist was a much more interesting character than the hypnotized zombie. And one of the inspirations that they discussed as they strolled the Kantstrasse Carnival was an eerie encounter that Janowitz had had at another amusement park many years earlier. This was back in 1913, before the war, in Hamburg at a place called Holstenwall. Hans was enjoying the hustle and bustle when his eyes alit on a pretty young girl, a flirtatious creature, who seemed to be on her way to an assignation with her boyfriend. Curious, Janowitz followed her. After a while, she ducked into some bushes, and then a few moments later, Hans saw an ordinary-looking man emerge from the bushes and walk away. It was a weird sight, almost as if the girl had been transformed into the man, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. The man emerged, but where had the girl gone? The next day, Janowitz heard that the night before, a girl had been murdered. And a terrible thought occurred to him. He must have seen the murder. The fear that maybe he had been witness to something awful compelled Hans to go to the girl's funeral. And there, in the crowd, he saw the same man. No, it couldn't be. Could it? Janowitz never learned the man's name, and the crime was never solved. They named the town of Holstenwall in this film for this incident, which haunts the margins of a story dominated by madness and murder. Now, according to Janowitz's account of events, Karl Mayr also had a special inspiration when it came to writing the character of the hypnotist. The story goes that when World War I hit, Mayr had been called up to serve, but objected on moral grounds. Mayr supposedly refused to be educated in the craftsmanship of murder on behalf of a fatherland that had gone mad with its own power. But how to get out of his responsibility to put on a uniform and go kill or be killed for his Kaiser? Karl tried to convince the military psychiatrist that he was insane. And in turn, the psychiatrist attempted to prove that Mayr was faking. As Janowitz put it, the two became locked in an epic battle of wills, and as you may have noticed, it's the exact scenario at the heart of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, written decades later. In fact, the idea of having to prove that you were insane to avoid being forced to participate in a criminally insane war was the original meaning of Catch-22, the dilemma that coined the term. It was a dilemma later adapted into dark comedy with the character of Klinger on the TV show MASH. To hear Janowitz tell it, this was the true origin of Dr. Caligari. They might have embellished it with the hypnotic aspects they witnessed at the Kantstrasse sideshow, and given him an evocative name plucked from a book, but the crux of it was a way of depicting a seemingly respectable authority gone mad with power and using it to terrorize others. Cesare is like the army, Janowitz said, a murderous force who is morally not guilty for the crimes he is forced to commit by the madman or madmen who compel his actions. That criminal war was fought by somnambulist soldiers, their minds enslaved and their wills subverted. Now, as we shall see as we approach the finale of this film, that particular interpretation of the movie is especially freighted with ideology. Accepting it as the intended meaning of the movie skews how you will respond to other narrative developments and colors how you will react to certain behind-the-scenes decisions. So, let's take a moment to cast some doubt on whether that was the intended, baked-in, there from day one intention behind the film. You see, even in Janowitz's own account of events in The Story of a Famous Story, he admitted that it was years afterward that he realized their subconscious intention to correlate Dr. Caligari and Cesare to the hated state authorities and their zombified citizenry. Not even Janowitz claims that these were conscious intentions when they wrote the script. And I suspect that when he says it was years later that he started to understand this, what he means is that it was only when he started consulting with Krakauer and heard Krakauer's arguments did he retroactively fit his memories to match. Now, I'll admit it's an intriguing interpretation of the film, but this is not a situation where the only viable interpretation of the film is to read Caligari as the German government and Cesare as the conscripted military. That's one possible interpretation, but the movie's power is such that it encompasses more than that one reading, so we have to be mindful of not limiting our scope here. Additionally, Karl Mayr wasn't dismissed from the army for mental health issues. Rolf Hempel's biography of Mayr shows that the documentary evidence actually reveals that he was discharged from the infantry after a single day because of a childhood foot injury that rendered him unfit for service. No epic battle of wills with a soulless psychiatrist representing a corrupt, insane government ever occurred. And so right from the outset we encounter the problem. Hans Janowitz's story behind the making of Caligari has a particular ideology to it. He tells it as the story of principled artists attempting something original, innovative, and politically edgy, but whose art was blunted by the interference of less conscientious, less artistic minds. As stories go, this is a familiar one, almost a cliché in itself. And, as filtered through Siegfried Krakauer's lens, Janowitz's story took on an additional ideology, about a film intended to criticize the ruling order that was undermined by changes that turned it into a reactionary film. But as we reconcile these different behind-the-scenes accounts, a fair bit of Janowitz's memories are going to fall to the facts. Regardless of how Mayr left the service, he found his calling as a screenwriter, and in the years that followed Caligari, he wrote dozens of scripts, including a number of F.W. Murnau's greatest hits, including The Haunted Castle, The Last Laugh, Tartuffe, Sunrise, and The Four Devils. There are two things to know about how Mayr wrote. One, he wrote in an expressionist style, choosing his words with power and economy, sketching what needed to be said to evoke the right image but avoiding excess verbiage. And two, he wrote really slowly, maddeningly slowly, and it caused F.W. Murnau no small amount of trouble to deal with his glacial pace and perfectionism. But Murnau kept coming back for more because Mayr was worth it and almost impossible to replace. Then came the 1930s. Mayr wrote a film for Leni Riefenstahl, but watching the incoming Nazi regime, being a Jew and a pacifist, Mayr saw the writing on the wall. He went to London and joined the UK film industry, but this was not a second act in his illustrious career. It was a disappointing epitaph. He died of cancer in 1944, impoverished and virtually forgotten. His country had been defeated and basically destroyed. A new Germany would take its place. And the art form he perfected, the silent film, was also an extinct species. Other writers, playwrights, and novelists They left behind printed works that would live on as their legacy, but short of remakes, movie scripts weren't made for reuse, and until the advent of script books in the later parts of the 20th century, they weren't even published at all. When he died, Meyer's genius was too easily ignored. Now, there's one additional detail of Meyer's life I should tell you about, so let's rewind and roll back to 1918. I told you a few minutes ago that Hans Janowitz had fallen in love with an actress named Gilda Langer, and she encouraged him to write a script with Karl Meyer. But I didn't tell you that Meyer was also in love with her. So yes, it was a classic love triangle, and by writing her into the film that they wrote together, Meyer and Janowitz took that private conflict and externalized it, dramatized it. They wrote the role of Jane for her, but when the movie was made, the part went to Lil Dagover instead. Now, when the story of the making of Caligari is told, it's often suggested that the reason Gilda Langer didn't appear in the film is that she died, fulfilling the ominous prophecy that she herself had sought out. But that's another myth that doesn't hold up to the facts. For one thing, as ominous prophecies go, it wasn't nearly as on point as the histories make it sound. The fortune teller said Janowitz was coming back safe from the front, which was a statement about the immediate future that came true pretty much right away. But as for Gilda being doomed, she lived until 1920, 2 years after the doom-laden fortune was told. Now, you certainly wouldn't expect an otherwise healthy young woman living in peacetime to die at age 24. That's pretty extraordinary and sad. But she didn't miss out on Caligari because she was dead. She was actually alive through the entire production. Torn between Meyer and Janowitz, Gilda Langer took the chance to trade up from a pair of starving writers in favor of an up-and-coming director and producer named Paul Zinner. By marrying Zinner, Gilda effectively left their orbit. But when she left Janowitz and Meyer, she left a shadow on the work that she'd inspired. Her absence from the film is still a sort of presence in itself. Cesare tells the future and predicts Alan's death, another overt intrusion into the film of the experiences of its writers. They'd planned Cesare to be played by their friend Ernst Deutsch, who'd introduced them to his colleague Werner Krauss. And they were so taken by Krauss's abilities, they wrote the role of Caligari expressly for him, which is perhaps an odd detail. In hindsight, we can see that these two men put together one of the most important films of the 1920s, and so the fact that they had such particular notions of who would be in it seems appropriate and natural. But these two men had never sold a movie script before. They had no reason to believe that this thing they're writing will ever be made, much less that they'll be able to dictate how it will be made. Janowitz said that he and Meyer believed they should write their script as if it were a straitjacket for the director, so precise in its specifications that it left no room for the director to deviate from their intentions. Accordingly, Janowitz maintains that the innovation of having the scenery painted directly onto the canvas instead of customary set design was written into the script and was part of their conception from the start. There's a lot in that particular issue to unpack, and we'll have to return to it later in this conversation once some additional behind-the-scenes characters have made their entrances. But I'm sure that by now you've picked up on the fact that this film doesn't look like most films. The exaggerated, stylized, and abstracted sets make no attempt to realistically depict any actual locations, but rather sketch out something more like a dreamscape. This is, of course, what they mean when they talk about German Expressionism. This is one of those you'll know it when you see it phenomena, because it's actually quite difficult to describe Expressionism in words. But hey, let's try. One of the reasons Expressionism is tough to describe is that it wasn't a proper art movement. And by that I mean, in the early 20th century, there were a flurry of art movements: Fauvism and Cubism, Futurism, Romanticism, and so on. And you knew that they were movements because they were organized. There were leaders, manifestos, membership rosters, internal politics. By contrast, there was no such formal organization behind Expressionism. But here's the thing, right? You can paint or sculpt in a Fauvist or a Cubist or a Romanticist style without being a member of that group. Being a true Cubist isn't about painting in the most truly Cubist style. It's about being a recognized member of the group. Someone who isn't a member can paint in a Cubist style, and they'd be something else, and that's where Expressionism arose, a conglomeration of artists whose work had hints of these other movements, Cubism and Romanticism, Fauvism and Futurism, but who weren't claimed by those other movements. Now there's another distinction to be drawn, and that's between aesthetics and morals. Now broadly speaking, the difference between avant-garde art and modern art is that modern art is about an aesthetic reaction to what's gone before, an attempt to push out into new aesthetic frontiers, whereas avant-garde art employs those new aesthetics in the service of creating social change. Now, within those parameters, we can see that while Expressionism may not be a formal movement, it is avant-garde, because it had both an aesthetic and a moral component. The aesthetics were driven by a reaction against Impressionism, in which abstraction and other stylistic devices were used to render the real world in an evocative way. Consider a Monet haystack. The haystack isn't really a jumble of multicolored hash marks, but those colorful dots and dashes create an impression of a real haystack. Expressionism isn't concerned with using stylized tricks to render the real world, but in using precise techniques to render an unreal world. These jagged lines and distorted angles suggest only the implication of a small town. The eerie quality of this place is baked into its architecture. It isn't just that uncanny things happen here, it's fundamentally an uncanny place to start with. And that's where we come to the moral component. Expressionist art actually had its heyday well before this film. It was dying out by 1920. The apex of Expressionism was before the First World War. Expressionist literature, painting, drama, sculpture, and poetry flourished in the years leading up to the war as a countercultural rejection of the materialism of the contemporary world and a gesture towards a new spirituality. Expressionist art emphasized the uncanny and the grotesque as a form of social critique. Implicit in that critique was the idea that the world was flawed, that it needed to change, that it would change. There was a calamity coming, an apocalypse, that would wipe out the corrupt present order and inaugurate a new world order. A better world was coming. Today's nightmares were just the darkness before the dawn. And when the First World War hit, many Expressionists saw it as the apocalypse that they'd always seen coming. This was the event that would change the world, the war to end all wars. Except it didn't happen like that. Instead of making the world a better place, the war just made it worse. The idealistic Expressionists were disillusioned, their hopes routed. Without that guiding moral force, a lot of the energy got sucked out, and by 1920 it was no longer a provocative avant-garde. The new avant-garde was turning away from the extravagance of Expressionism and its discredited ideals towards a new sobriety, which was a return to conventional forms and realism. Expressionism continued to exist, but it had now been around long enough to become fashionable. Avant-garde art is for the angry, underground, countercultural revolutionaries, but fashionable art gets bought by rich people and appropriated for commercial uses. Expressionist art had been a mainstay in movie houses for a few years now, not by appearing in the movies, but by appearing in the movie posters. To have the insane zigzags and vertiginous swirls of Expressionist art invade the movie screen itself was something new. And to understand how it came to pass is going to take some more digging. It was April 1919. Janowitz and Meyer were surviving by pawning their belongings, but they'd run out of things to hawk and didn't have enough money left to cover both food and rent, so they chose food. They needed to sell the script. They needed to do it soon. Fritz Lang was at the time a rising star in the world of German cinema, and he helped introduce Janowitz to Erich Pommer, the Decla studio chief responsible for nurturing Lang's career. Janowitz immediately insisted on booking an appointment with the producer, and Pommer was more than a bit put off by this young man's impertinence. Who was this upstart to think he could just barge in and demand an audience? But Pommer must have been intrigued by that impertinence, and if Fritz thought these kids were worth listening to, what the hell? They made an appointment for 4 p.m. that day. Janowitz and Meyer arrive. They're greeted by Pommer and his assistant, Julius Sternheim, and the writers start to read their script aloud, scene for scene. At the conclusion of the reading, Sternheim and Pommer insist the writers aren't leaving until they sign a contract. A deal is written up on the spot. By 8 p.m., the ink is wet on the contract just 4 hours after the writers arrived for their meeting. It's not the money the writers had hoped for, but it is money. And Pommer has a crackerjack script bought for cheap, which he can put into production with a low budget. It's a win-win. Now, it's worth noting that Pommer's and Janowitz's versions of the story vary in some specifics. Pommer remembers that he paid a mere 800 marks for the script. Janowitz says that he and Meyer went in insisting on a minimum of 10,000 marks, but ended up agreeing to 6,500 up front with a contingency payment of another 2,000 if the film actually went in front of cameras, and yet another 1,000 in the unlikely circumstance that it was sold for foreign release. As it happens, the contract has survived and we can resolve this dispute. The writers agreed to accept 4,000 marks for their script. They agreed to participate in developing marketing and promotional material for the film at no additional charge, but would receive credit for their authorship of the script. There is another clause in the contract that would prove to be significant. The producers retained the right to any changes deemed necessary either sooner or later, and the writers agreed to oblige with writing any such changes upon request. Which brings us to one of the central discrepancies that we need to resolve. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, whether they got paid 800 marks or 10,000 or 4,000, it's just a trivia question. But the extent to which the finished production reflects their intentions has been the crux of nearly a century worth of hand-wringing and academic debate. First things first, both Janowitz and Pommer actually tell roughly the same story here. They differ on how much money changed hands, but the compressed time frame and the urgency with which the deal was struck is something both men remember. Now, we have to be cautious about the rosy glasses of hindsight. Talking about Caligari from the perspective of the 1950s, Pommer could knowingly look back on one of the most significant accomplishments of his career, one of the films that made his name, established German film as a major cultural force, and lasted as an acclaimed masterpiece. Of course, he's going to want to present himself as the prescient and savvy businessman who recognized genius when it walked in his office door. But on that April afternoon in 1919, what really went through his mind then? Could he possibly have foreseen that this would be a masterpiece blockbuster? Actually, Pommer says the thing that most caught his attention was that this was a Grand Guignol-style mystery thriller that he could make on the cheap. Janowitz says that he and Meyer had written into the script that the sets would be abstracted paintings to be done in the style of Alfred Kuben. Indeed, Janowitz says that he'd reached out to Kuben and asked him to join the production as a designer, but the painter demurred, so they just wrote in the style of Kuben. Kuben was an expressionist, but his style of expressionism was more on the surrealist side of things. His uncanny landscapes are pornographic without being erotic, haunting, Goya-esque visions of gloom and shadow. His style is absolutely appropriate for a story like Caligari, but his hallucinatory imagery is also completely unlike what this movie ended up looking like. Nosferatu is closer to his style than this is. So somewhere along the line, the plan to have Kubenistic sets fell by the wayside and the design ended up more cubistic. Now, the similarity of those words isn't just a quirk of English, they're actually even closer in German. To say Kuben-like, you'd write Kubinische. And if you didn't know who Kuben was, or you just misread it, you might think the word was Kubistische, cubist. That's what Janowitz thinks happened, that his note referencing Kubinische designs was misread as Kubistische designs, and the film ended up like this. But there's a problem with that. For most of the 20th century, all the histories and analysis of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari occurred under the assumption that the original screenplay was a lost artifact, and so the closest we could come to knowing what was in it was to take Janowitz at his word. If he says he called for Kubinische designs, then that was that. But a copy of the screenplay did survive. And more than that, it survived in the possession of the chief production designer, Hermann Warm. His widow reluctantly sold it to the Stiftung Deutsche Kinemathek in 1978, and suddenly, film scholars had a chance to compare what was actually in the thing to what was in the movie. Now, there's been some argument over whether this script was actually the final shooting script or an early draft. Mike Budd has supposed it to be an early draft. David Robinson has argued persuasively, in my opinion, that it is the actual one and only script. But here's the thing, you don't actually have to resolve that argument. Either way, this is the version that the writers sold to Pommer, that inaugurated the production, and which was given to the design staff. If any subsequent drafts were created in the 6 months that elapsed between signing the contract and principal photography, this was the copy the designers used to plan the production. And there are no references to Kuban anywhere in it, nor any references to having abstracted sets in an expressionist style. And of course, this omission calls into doubt whether the writers actually had any role in that decision at all. Bear in mind that the film's enduring importance and popularity was based on its visual design. Without the expressionist design, this movie may not have been a hit. So if you want to ride the film's coattails and use it to advance your own reputation, you need to keep yourself aligned with that aspect of it. There is a huge incentive for Janowitz to exaggerate his involvement in that creative decision. So you could take that suspicion and conclude that Janowitz is illegitimately staking a claim here. But I don't agree with that. For one thing, the fact that Janowitz and Pommer both independently describe an original intention to use designs based on the work of Alfred Kuban suggests that they did indeed talk about this, whether it was formally written into the script or not. Also, it's a curious detail that Janowitz's claim isn't that he proposed the kind of expressionist design work that actually ended up in the film and received such massive acclaim. He claims that he proposed a dead end of an idea that got misunderstood. So let's take him at his word, more or less, and grant that during the April 19th meeting, he and Meyer pitched the idea that their mystery story would be visualized with non-traditional sets based on the avant-garde art of Alfred Kuban. Pommer is intrigued by the idea because of the cost-saving aspects, and he buys the script. But he isn't contractually obligated to adhere to that idea because it isn't in the script, and the contract gives him the right to change the script at his discretion anyway. Now, it's another 6 months before the film goes into pre-production, and only in late 1919 did any design work get underway. Pommer remembers that he handed the script over to Decla's design department and left it up to them to come up with something appropriate. Now then again, he misremembers the names of the design staff, which is a bit sketchy. Pommer claims the design staff came to him with these bizarre set designs and tried to sell him on them as a cost-saving measure. He was presiding over a cash-strapped organization that struggled to keep the lights on. Literally, they operated under an electricity quota. Lights cost money. And here were designers pitching an idea about simply painting the lighting effects onto the sets. Supposedly, he wasn't convinced, and it took shooting a test reel to win him over. Now, a fair bit of this is patently absurd. This film was shot at the Lixie Glasshouse Studio, which, as its name implies, was a stage with a glass ceiling and glass walls to capture as much sunlight as possible. But even so, this was shot in wintertime, when sunlight is at a premium, and photos of the studio show that the studio used sunlight as a primary light source, but invariably augmented it with electric lights. Literally painting lighting effects onto Caligari's stages definitely saved production time and the costs associated with that time, but it didn't obviate the need to have electric lights. Furthermore, all of the contemporary publicity and news coverage of the production leading up to its release identify the producer as Rudolf Meinert, not Erich Pommer. Pommer may well have been the producer who brought the project into Decla's auspices, but unless every journalist who visited the set was mistaken, Meinert was the one who actually oversaw the production. Hermann Warm said that he never saw Pommer in connection with the film, and for that matter, neither Janowitz nor Meyer were on set at any point. Warm says that he was brought on by producer Meinert and director Robert Wiene and told to start conceptualizing. Warm took one look at the script and realized that it called for something special, and he reached outside the Decla design staff to a pair of freelance painters of his acquaintance, Walter Reimann and Walter Ruhrig. Reimann was himself something of an expressionist painter, and photos of him in his studio show him with some impressive canvases full of angular zigzags of a Caligari-esque flavor. According to Varm, Riemann was the one who argued for this distinctive look and convinced his colleagues, Rohrig and Varm, to go along. They drafted up some preliminary sketches and took them back to Meinert and Wiene. As the story goes, Wiene was immediately excited, but Meinert needed a day to mull it over. When Meinert finally agreed, he threw his whole support behind it. He allegedly told the designers to go as eccentric as they could, to not pull any punches, because he wanted to promote the film as an artistic experiment. He figured this might make it somewhat critic-proof, because if audiences responded positively to the novelty, it would be a sensation. And if they responded negatively, he could isolate the criticism by saying, okay, at least we tried something new, audiences just aren't ready for this avant-garde stuff. Varm also said that Meinert was the chief proponent of the Expressionist experiment against all studio opposition. And although Varm doesn't name that studio opposition, the implication is that Meinert was the one pushing the stylistic choice against Pommer's objections. Speaking of objections, journalist Barnett Braverman, in 1926, wrote that it was director Robert Wiene who was the initiator of the design decision, and that the writers had resisted Wiene's approach, and years later continued to object to Wiene's Cubist-inspired designs, which is ironic, given how Janowitz later said that Wiene was the one who was uncomfortable with the Expressionist imagery and tried to reduce or remove it. In particular, the writers blamed Wiene for adding a narrative frame to their story, in which it is revealed that this entire story is told by a man locked up in an insane asylum, and the Expressionist stylings are concentrated within that flashback story told by Francis. While everyone involved in Caligari had an incentive to claim that they were responsible for coming up with the Expressionist designs, everyone had a similar incentive to disclaim any responsibility for the framing device, as utterly loathed and controversial a thing as you can imagine. Except there was one man who did step forward and claim ownership of that idea, someone who was bold enough to take responsibility for coming up with the framing scenes and continued to maintain that they were a good idea. His name was Fritz Lang. He may be the most significant creative force associated with the film who actually didn't work on the film. The Fritz Lang of 1919 was not yet the man he became. The director of visually striking fantastic thrillers really started directing visually striking fantastic thrillers only in the wake of Caligari. And he absorbed it thoroughly. Lang's Testament of Dr. Mabuse is almost a secret remake of Caligari. In the 1940s, Janowitz tried to launch a proper remake of Caligari to be directed by Lang. But if Caligari helped make Lang, then Lang also helped make Caligari. As we've seen, he helped broker the connection from Janowitz and Meyer to Pommer. And it seems that Pommer's original choice of director for Caligari was Fritz Lang, although in the end Lang would end up directing Part 2 of Spiders, while Robert Wiene and company were making Caligari. Looking back on his brief involvement with the pre-production of Caligari, Lang remembered that when he saw the sketches by Hermann Varm's design team, he thought audiences would be really put off by the imagery that was so aggressively weird, so Lang proposed setting those scenes off as a sort of dream sequence, framed by more realistic imagery to make it easier to swallow. Now, there are some potential discrepancies in Lang's account. If you accept Hermann Varm's timeline, which I tend to do, then the Expressionist designs were first drawn up on Robert Wiene's behalf. So if Lang was proposing anything in response to seeing them, he was doing so well after he'd stopped having any formal role on the project. But I don't see that as a real conflict. Lang was one of Decla's promising new directors and one of Erich Pommer's allies. He wouldn't have had to have any formal, direct responsibility on the project for Wiene or someone else to have consulted him for advice, and it was thoroughly consistent with Lang's personality for him to be suspicious of the Expressionist imagery. He didn't have much patience for Expressionism. Furthermore, Lang didn't invent the framing story. He may have suggested using it to frame the Expressionist imagery, but the script already had a frame. What's that, you say? Yes, the original script that Janowitz and Meyer sold to Erich Pommer already had a framing story built in. It was different than what ended up on screen. It starts off with Francis and Jane happily married, and they're entertaining some guests. The passing of some gypsy caravans triggers unhappy memories, and Francis goes into flashback to relate his tale, and so begins the story of Caligari and Cesare. There are other changes from the script to the film. The script set the action in the modern world with modern technology like telephones, but the film locates the action in a fairy tale-like setting of an ambiguous past. And like any good fairy tale, there's a monster and a damsel in distress. Even if you've never seen this movie before, you've likely seen this scene, or one of its many descendants, as the same iconography was still echoing through Hammer's horror films of the 1950s and 60s. The influence of this film on James Whale's Frankenstein films and Universal's Gothic horror films of the 1930s is palpable. Not just this scene, but repeatedly throughout this film, there are iconic moments that are echoed or outright mimicked by Universal's art department. Fans of Universal's Gothic horror films should be having déjà vu moments all through this film. Universal's art designer, Charlie Hall, was greatly influenced by Caligari, as well as by Nosferatu and Metropolis. Meanwhile, directors like James Whale or Todd Browning staged their shots as visual quotations from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, speaking of directors, the director of this film has been conspicuously absent from my remarks, hasn't he? I've mentioned the name Robert Wiene a handful of times, but I've barely talked about him, and we're already more than 45 minutes into the film. For that matter, of all the attention this film has received, Wiene is barely mentioned. He's a footnote in his own story, an afterthought in his own masterpiece. This is in part due to how much of Caligari's legacy has come from Krakauer's book, a proxy for Janowitz's grudges. But another reason we know so little about Robert Wiene is that he shunned the public spotlight and left behind a sparse documentary record. We're not even entirely sure where or when he was born, which you'd think would be fairly basic information. He was of Hungarian origin and spent much of his life in Vienna. He was 20-some years older than the other biggies of German film, Fritz Lang, F.W. Murnau, G.W. Pabst. When Decla assigned him to direct Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Wiene was already an established director of strong repute, known for commercially successful productions with popular stars. He was also a sincere cinema artist who believed movies were their own unique art form and needed to be more than just filmed plays. His father, Carl Wiene, was a highly regarded theatrical actor who suffered from a nervous condition and memory loss and was obliged to retire early. Of Carl's two sons, Conrad Wiene was the one seen as most likely to take up the family business. He was also an actor and quickly took up work as a movie director. Meanwhile, Robert Wiene initially showed no interest in the arts and instead studied law at the University of Vienna. He appears to have practiced law for a time, but gradually found himself pulled into the world of his brother. By 1912, Robert Wiene started directing movies after all, and by 1919, with over 30 films to his name as writer, director, or both, he was a proven commodity. Of all the people who've claimed responsibility for Caligari's distinctive visual style, Robert Wiene is the only one who made more movies that looked like it. For a man who allegedly resisted the Expressionist design, Wiene went on to make other Expressionist films like Genuine and Raskolnikov with the same visual style. Caligari marked a crucial turning point in Wiene's career. From this point on, he made fewer films, but they were bigger and more ambitious. As the silent era neared its end, he was making big-budget comedies in the style of Ernst Lubitsch, with Germany's top female stars. He had his own production company and enjoyed the freedom of being a successful independent filmmaker. He fled the Nazis in 1933 and died before the war ended. Throughout the production on Caligari, Decla's advertising staff carefully teased the audience about an impending mystery thriller like no other. Magazines printed two-page spreads with giant question marks and cryptic statements like, "You must become Caligari." When Caligari finally opened to general release in late February 1920, it was greeted by a hungry audience stoked by this clever promotional campaign and was also met by almost uniformly positive reviews. It ran for 4 weeks and played to sold-out crowds. Caligari was forced from theaters while it was still drawing substantial audiences simply because the next booking came along, but Decla revived it later in the spring and once again sold out its house. Caligari opened in New York's Capitol Theater, then the world's largest theater, to record-setting sales. Showman Samuel Roxy Rothafel hired actors to perform a live framing device that he'd added onto the film, yes, a frame around a frame, but that live frame was rarely used, and in most theaters it was simply shown as it appears here. The Los Angeles premiere in May 1921 was a less successful affair. There were public protests that succeeded in shutting down the screening. However, these protests weren't based on the film's avant-garde visual style. It was a purely economic complaint. The LA labor unions were worried that if German imports were too successful, it would siphon business away from Hollywood. That Germany was the enemy in the recently concluded World War was an added detail that helped the demonstrators rile up public sentiment against the film. The fact that German imports were showing up in U.S. theaters was a novelty, and while the protesters were wrong that German imports would ever seriously challenge the hegemony of Hollywood's domestic production, this was actually the spearhead of a new German invasion. Back in 1916, the German film industry had isolated itself entirely from the rest of the world with a broad ban on the import of foreign films. Movie-hungry German audiences were fed German films, which nurtured the domestic industry. Meanwhile, Hollywood had surged into global dominance, and with works like Charlie Chaplin's and D.W. Griffith's, they had a product capable of broad international appeal, but the German market remained closed to U.S. imports, and when the war ended, this was something Hollywood wanted fixed. Then, in May 1920, the German government passed the Reich Film Act, a law that reopened Germany to film imports. Up to 15% of films shown in German theaters could now originate abroad, and Hollywood was hungry to capture as much of that 15% as possible. Because the German theaters were operated by the production companies like Decla, in order to secure those German bookings, the U.S. companies had to agree to reciprocate by accepting German imports in return. Caligari would be one of the first films to benefit from this new arrangement. It would have access to a broader American market than any German film before it. And because it was so successful, it helped to create a lasting American audience for German films. And the thing is, Caligari played to sold-out houses, indisputably a commercial hit, while also prompting serious critics to gush about how it was proof that cinema could be art. The recognition of Caligari as not just a movie, but also a work of art, was something new. Movies weren't expected to be art, and art lovers tended to look askance at this boorish mass-market industrial product. To be an art house movie has a certain special meaning to us today, and here is where art house movies begin. Caligari came to the United Kingdom in 1924, and in several instances was performed with a live onstage frame similar to Roxy Rothafel's introduction. Not long after its initial run, Caligari was selected by the Film Society of London as a recurring repertory feature throughout the 20s and 30s. Similar film clubs sprung up in France and larger metropolitan areas of the U.S. to cater to highbrow audiences interested in celebrating films as artworks. These film clubs focused on foreign imports, smaller productions from outside the commercial mainstream, and revivals of classic works from the past. These film clubs sometimes evolved into actual small house theaters, the earliest art house cinemas, with the same mandate. Between these art house cinemas and film societies, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari was more or less screened somewhere at any given moment between 1920 and the mid-1930s. Ironically, Caligari was better seen outside of Germany during this period because the art house movement didn't really take off in Germany in the same way. So you had this demonstrated continued international demand for Caligari and a relative lack of availability at home, which was a situation ripe to inspire thoughts of remakes and/or sequels. As the German film industry began the transition from silent filmmaking to sound, director Robert Wiene started planning a sequel that he was going to call Caligarismus. He intended to once again treat the setting and production design as a playground for modern art. This time, he was going to focus on surrealism. But the advent of sound opened up new avenues for avant-garde experimentation. With a modernistic composer preparing the soundtrack, he was going to include sections of futuristic dialogue. and I have to admit the prospect of futuristic dialogue has my hair standing on end, so I'm not too sad this never came to pass, but it augured a long dry spell of not getting Caligari-related projects made. By 1944, both Erich Pommer and Hans Janowitz had relocated to America and had their own designs on a Hollywood remake and/or sequel, which is gloriously ironic, don't you think? When you want to make sure your artistic ambitions aren't compromised by cowardly Philistines, you sell it to a Hollywood studio, right? But Pommer and Janowitz found their plans stymied by complicated rights issues. While they floundered around trying to sort out the ownership, they had no shortage of creative inspirations. In 1945, Janowitz tried unsuccessfully to strike a deal with Fritz Lang for a remake, but the rights problem scuttled that plan. Then he started thinking about the next best thing, a sequel, variously called Caligari II, or The Return of Caligari, which would reconceive the character as a former Nazi officer and war criminal. Eventually, producer Robert Lippert sorted out the rights issues and mounted a remake directed by Roger Kay, from a screenplay by Robert Bloch. Yep, the guy who wrote Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. But this 1962 Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a remake in name only. Neither Pommer nor Janowitz were involved, and you have to squint hard to see any resemblance to the 1920 original. Francis's unmasking of the psychiatric ward director as Dr. Caligari is an impressive twist, and a shocking reveal that has received disproportionately little critical attention, which is odd. In about 10 minutes, the film is going to run through this unmasking routine a second time, once again revealing Caligari to be the asylum director, and that second twist has fueled generations of debate. But the discussion of the second twist rarely comments on the fact that it is made twice. For most of its existence, the received wisdom on how to read this film has been the Janowitz Krakauer interpretation. There were revolutionary artists on the forefront of aesthetic developments and innervated by a stinging rebuke to the prevailing authority. They set out to make a radical film, one that would be challenging in its visual vocabulary while also challenging the legitimacy of a state that sent its best and brightest out to murder in the name of empire. This artistic creation was weakened by smaller minds who misunderstood the power of the symbols they controlled and who catered only to the baser concerns of mainstream appeal and box office profits. It was the classic art versus commerce debate, but in this case it prefigured the rise of Hitler's Nazi state because what Weimar-era Germany needed most was to challenge authority, not reinforce it. I intend to tear that entire argument apart, word for word. But let's give Janowitz one last chance to make his case. As Janowitz told it, in his Story of a Famous Story, a preview screening was held for the production team, but Wiene didn't attend. Janowitz believed that Wiene skipped the screening to avoid a confrontation with the writers, who were about to discover how thoroughly their work had been violated. They raged at the frame story and threatened a lawsuit against Decla. Supposedly, Julius Sternheim calmed them down and convinced them not to air their grievances publicly, but privately. They continued to denounce what they called the rape of their work. I'm not kidding, that's the word they used. Then came the public premiere, a big gala event at the Berlin's West End on February 26, 1920. By this point, the production team was barely on speaking terms, and they rode to the event in almost total silence. As the limo pulled up to the theater, Pommer quietly whispered, "This will be a horrible failure for all of us." Solemnly, they filed into the theater. The venue was the Marmor House, the most prestigious theater in Kurfürstendamm. It was packed. The press was there, VIPs, as well as regular moviegoers. The theater darkened, and the screen started to flicker with weird angles and sinister shadows. In the orchestra pit, the musicians played a haunting soundtrack composed by Giuseppe Becce. And then, people started to gasp. Women fainted, some screamed. 78 minutes later, the place erupted in thunderous applause. It was a success, an unqualified, monster success. Wiene soaked it in, vindication. Meanwhile, the two writers slunk off to a bar to nurse their wounds and wonder, quote, whether our new scripts would also be produced in crippled forms by cowardly directors. Them's fightin' words. Now, we've already discussed how Janowitz admitted that he wasn't aware of any alleged subtext when they wrote the script, and how the supposed real-world events such as Meyer's battle with the army psychiatrist were fictional. Also, bear in mind that when Fritz Lang made Dr. Mabuse der Spieler just 2 years later, it was suffused with the very social criticisms and direct attacks on the corruption and illegitimacy of the status quo that was supposedly what Janowitz and Meyer intended for Caligari. And audiences took to Dr. Mabuse. It wasn't censored. Indeed, the critics and reviewers of the day recognized its message and commented thoughtfully on it. So German audiences in the early 1920s were sufficiently perceptive and receptive that if this is what Janowitz and Meyer really wanted to go for, they could have. But I've never seen any contemporary review of Caligari that picked up on that theme. If it was genuinely the heart of the film, so integral to its intentions that any violation of that theme threatened the integrity of the entire enterprise, then it's curious that nobody in 1920 seemed to read it that way at all. Even if you want to argue that audiences in 1920 were still too naively trusting of their leaders and weren't yet primed to read between the lines such a subversive message, I'd first go point to Abel Gance's J'accuse, also made in 1920 and way more anti-war than anything Caligari could conceivably have hoped for, and I'd also point out that Caligari was revived and redistributed throughout the 1920s and 30s throughout the world. At no point in this extended life of the film was this alleged subversive message noticed by contemporary audiences. And consider this. The movie is patiently explaining to us how it is that the insane criminal mastermind Caligari and the respected psychiatric director are one and the same. It's a flashback within a flashback, which shows how the doctor became gripped by an academic obsession and an urgent need to help a specific patient, and this set of circumstances pulled him into a vortex of madness. Caligari is a fictional identity he drapes himself in, while he uses and abuses his position of respect to insulate himself from suspicion. And in just a few minutes, the film is going to pull back to claim that Caligari is a real psychiatrist, and Francis is in fact his patient. By the time we get around to that, we will have sat through 70-some minutes in which Francis is a persecuted figure struggling to survive the predations of this villain. After spending all that time telling us Dr. Caligari is a dangerous liar prone to disguise who manipulates how others perceive him and has mind control powers, if the movie wants us to suddenly reorient our perception of him, it needs to invest in a little bit more than just bluntly saying, oh, he's actually the doctor and Francis is the patient. We get an explanation of how Herr Director turned into Dr. Caligari, and by contrast, no context of any kind is offered to explain where Francis's supposed delusion originated. So I flatly reject any suggestion that the frame story undermines the artistic integrity of the film. As far as I'm concerned, it's what gives it artistic legitimacy. The original script had a frame story in which everything was safely contained in a flashback told by Francis, whom we meet, knowing that he lives happily ever after with Jane. Dr. Caligari is an aberration in his world, a danger that society confronts and contains. The original script ends with a classic happy ending and signals the inevitability of that happy ending right from its opening sequence. But in the movie version, Dr. Caligari slips loose of all that and controls the narrative. He is exposed, yet he survives in his role as director. He never pays for his crimes. His accusers are discredited and put into his power. There's nothing safe about the movie's ending. And the film does nothing to legitimize Caligari's authority. At no point anywhere in the entire film is Caligari presented as sympathetic or trustworthy. At no point is Francis presented as unbalanced. Now, we are eventually told he is unbalanced, but we are told that by the very man we've been conditioned to distrust. It is wholly consistent with Caligari's modus operandi for him to exploit his position as the director to further isolate and oppress Francis. In fact, this is so straightforward a narrative direction to take, it is exactly what Fritz Lang does with similar material in The Testament of Dr. Mabuse in 1933. And notice how that is exactly how audiences have reacted. Since 1920, nobody watching this film has ever bought the frame. Nobody comes out of this saying, yeah, Francis was crazy and so his story was nonsense. Instead, they come out saying, the movie would have been better without the frame. which is just another way of saying they don't believe Caligari at the end. He isn't persuasive. The last-minute bracketing of some realistic imagery just isn't realistic enough to convince us. Francis's perspective wins. His version of events is what audiences accept. So let's think about it this way. Let's imagine, for argument's sake, that the movie had been made without the frame, without any frame, and stayed in its expressionist mode throughout. Now, this is what most critics have been advocating for close to 100 years now. It's what Krakauer said should have been done. Now, if that's what had happened, how would audiences react? You'd reach this climax, you'd be at this point in the movie thinking that Francis was right in condemning Caligari, and that his world was shown in crazy angles because it was itself a crazy world. It wasn't the dream of a madman, it was a stylized depiction of a real world in which criminals held positions of power. So, if that's what we agree audiences are thinking at this point, if you want the viewer to reject that position and suddenly accept an alternate reading, you need to put some effort into establishing that alternative. Now, critics have generally assumed that the mere presence of realistic, traditionally representational sets in the frame story, in and of themselves, served to establish that alternative. Radical critics of the day, like Blaise Cendrars or Herbert Gehring, certainly bought that perspective. They accused the film of equating expressionism with madness. And it is true that the framing device does give us two different aesthetic environments. One is traditionally representational in nature, more or less, and the other is exaggerated and stylized. Furthermore, it is true that most movies are realistic in style. Most movies expect their viewers to accept the stories they tell as realistic stories to be taken seriously. It follows that all things being equal, audience sympathies would naturally incline them to perceive the realistic environment as the real world and the exaggerated one as the dream world. But the question is, are all things equal? Consider The Matrix as an example. It also traffics in two different aesthetic environments, one of which is more or less traditionally representational in its depiction of a world like the one the audience lives in, and the other is a sci-fi dystopia of humans with oily cyborg bolt plugs in their bodies living on spaceships and at war with flying robots. But through its narrative devices, The Matrix explains that the audience is meant to perceive the sci-fi dystopia as the real world and the normal-looking world as the dreamscape. Now, film theorists have studied how the experience of watching a motion picture is so immersive that films have a significant leeway in doing things that would seemingly violate suspension of disbelief, but which don't, because the audience's willing suspension of disbelief is a flexible contract. Editorial devices have no analog in our day-to-day experience of the world, yet we accept them as the grammar of film. We recognize movie stars, yet buy them time and again as new people in new circumstances. Outlandish, unreal things can happen on screen. Physics can be defied, history rewritten, performers in musicals suddenly break into song, and we go along. In short, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari could, if it wanted, posit that the exaggerated expressionist environment is the real world, and the representational environment is the fiction. And it is my opinion that is exactly what the film argues. Consider the frame. It consists of two sequences, not just the one at the end, but also one at the beginning. And in the very opening scene of the movie, Francis starts telling another man that he's got a doozy of a weird story to tell. The other man's eyes keep defocusing and rolling back into his head, and then a ghost-like woman staggers through like one of Dracula's wives, and Francis calmly identifies her as his fiancée. We haven't yet been given any context to explain any of these unsettling images. On first viewing, the audience is just confronted by these oddities cold, in a space that seems very much like an outdoor courtyard, but not quite right. And then the film jumps into flashback mode and dials up the visual stylization to an exaggerated level, but that's precisely my point. The effect is not to jump from a representational, realistic environment into an expressionist dreamscape. It is to move from one scene of disquieting semi-reality to an even greater unreality. We don't move between opposing aesthetic environments, we slide along a scale. Okay, now here's something else to consider. By far and away, the most significant, lasting, and immediate influence wrought by this film was a change in the attitude of German filmmakers towards studio locations. After this film, practically every film made in Germany was shot in the studio, even for ostensibly exterior scenes. Suddenly, it became the fashion to have design teams build outdoor sets on indoor stages. Films like Nosferatu were the oddball exceptions, relying on real locations when the rest of the industry no longer did that. But let's rephrase that, because what we're really saying here is that prior to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, German films routinely shot outdoor spaces in real outdoor locations. And so, the audience that came to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari came in with certain aesthetic expectations established by experience, including that outdoor spaces would have been filmed at real locations. But this asylum courtyard is not a real location, it's a studio set, just like everything else. Now, it may not be as excessively stylized and distorted as the other sets, but it is already stylized and abstracted to a degree simply by dint of being an indoor set. And what this means is that when we get to this point in the movie and the film is unwinding out of Francis's flashback and returning us to the contemporary setting of the courtyard, it is not right to say that we have emerged out of the Expressionist imagery and back into realistic imagery, because the courtyard scene wasn't properly realistic to start with. Don't believe me yet? Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to prove it to you. All right, then, you're so smart. How exactly do you explain the appearance of this highly expressionist set appearing in the supposedly realistic outer frame? And you know, even Siegfried Kracauer agrees with me on this one. He writes that the attempts by the Philistine cowards to embargo the expressionist imagery into a madman's viewpoint failed, because the filmmakers failed to exclude expressionist sets from the frame, and so the appearance of expressionism in the frame undermined their efforts, which is just silly. Why not say that the appearance of expressionist imagery in the frame undermines your argument that Robert Wiene was even trying to isolate the imagery unambiguously in a dream sequence? And let's pause for a moment and really dig into whether the expressionist imagery constitutes the revolutionary avant-garde vision that is so often assumed. While it's certainly true that expressionist designs of this type hadn't been used in a popular film by this point, it doesn't follow that this innovative and pioneering style was revolutionary. Expressionism was avant-garde a decade earlier. By 1920, Expressionism was on its last gasp as an art form. It had been substantially co-opted for commercial uses, such as advertisements and movie posters, which is not where you'd expect to find avant-garde art. And for that matter, the true avant-garde in 1920s Germany had turned to the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new sobriety. Named for a one-off art exhibition that soon spilled out to a full-fledged movement, the new sobriety was an American-influenced, no-nonsense engagement with practical reality and a return to conventional forms and traditional representationalism. I kid you not. As an art movement, it died off when the Nazis came to power, but if you really wanted to see an avant-garde version of Caligari, they would have dispensed with all the symbolism and just gone for realism. You could argue the expressionist stuff was just a marketing gimmick, and the most avant-garde material is in the realistic outer frame. So what we have is a setup where Francis knows the truth about Caligari but can't get anyone to take him seriously because Caligari controls the story. Caligari is a respected figure. The world takes him at his face value, and so his perspective is presented as a realistic, representational one, because that's how he sells it to the wider world. And Francis knows the truth, but he's arguing against what others accept as real. He knows the world is insane, and so when he accurately describes it, it sounds crazy, it looks crazy. If the filmmakers were Philistine cowards who wanted to indict expressionist imagery as visions of madness, they had no reason to allow those images to extend into the supposedly rational frame. And if they wanted the audience to accept the authority of the kindly Dr. Caligari, here to save poor Francis from his fanciful delusions, then they had no reason to spend so much time justifying that Caligari was insane, and so little time justifying any such conclusion about Francis. In fact, it's only when Caligari shows up in the courtyard and says he can cure Francis that we have any suggestion that the story we've just watched isn't to be taken at face value. I'll accept that the writers, being new to the business, were very likely taken aback by the changes to their conception of the film and naturally held Wiene responsible for them. But it doesn't seem likely that they were really all that furious at the time. Both Janowitz and Meyer signed an additional agreement allowing Decla to publish a novelization of the film based on the actual finished film, not their earlier script. If they'd wanted to block that and insist on reinstating their original ideas, they had the chance. But they didn't object, and they took the 2,000 franc royalty without complaint. Karl Meyer worked with Robert Wiene again right away, making another Expressionist film called Genuine. So let's set aside the histories and just look to the movie itself as the ultimate evidence. And how does it end? In an outlandishly Expressionist asylum, where Dr. Caligari has insinuated himself into a position of unshakable power. The story is disrupted, it's discontinuous. We never even see how he captures Francis, only that he does. And then what happens? Caligari looks into the camera and the frame irises in on his face in a callback to how he was first introduced an hour